It's easy to forget that most criminals aren't masterminds. They don't wear tailored suits or plot in shadows with a glass of bourbon and jazz in the background. They're quiet people, familiar, sometimes even comforting, like the man who made candles on the corner of Washington and Elm. You wouldn't have suspected Samuel Hirsch. He looked like someone's grandfather, wire-framed glasses, soft-spoken, with a faint smell of beeswax and cedar clinging to his flannel. He owned Hirsch and Sons Candleworks, although no one had ever seen the Sons. His shop had stood in the same spot in New Paltz, New York, for nearly 30 years. And for 27 of those years, it was the kind of place you'd stop in for handmade tapers or cinnamon-scented votives. But for 3 of those years, it was also the endpoint of a trail of missing gold, unfiled tax paperwork, and federal suspicion. The disappearance that did look like one. The story begins not with Samuel, but with a gold broker named Thomas Neary, who went missing in March 1997. A quiet man himself, Neary was an IRS-certified intermediary, often working with estate lawyers and coin collectors in the Hudson Valley. He was last seen at a coffee shop in Kingston, a routine meetup to hand over valuation documents. No one raised an eyebrow when he didn't show up for work the next day. Neary had no family, lived alone, and didn't socialize much. It wasn't until a court clerk followed up on a missed probate appointment that his absence became a file in a manila folder. The file sat in a drawer until late June when a retired NYPD officer turned private investigator, Clara Voss, was hired by a concerned estate lawyer who had used Neary's services for years. Clara was known for her patience and her odd ability to get people talking. Her notes, later entered into evidence, describe her visit to Hirsch and Sons with clinical brevity. Shop smells of lavender and old varnish. Owner is cooperative, offers coffee, says he's never heard of Neary, noticed wax spill on apron, very clean workspace. Gut says too clean. Inventory inconsistencies and candle molds. The first red flag wasn't in Samuel's shop, it was in his tax filings. IRS flagged him the previous year for unreported income inconsistencies, but the investigation didn't go anywhere. His reported revenue was modest, but bank deposits told a different story. Several lump sum cash deposits, each under the $10,000 reporting threshold, had been made across multiple banks. Not enough to arrest him, but enough to keep watching. Clara began to look into Samuel's supply chain. Beeswax, wicks, scent oils, mold suppliers. She discovered that in 1996, Samuel had ordered a new batch of custom candle molds, dozens of them more than what a single artisan shop would reasonably need. He had also started producing extra-heavy pillar candles, with a peculiar density inconsistent with wax alone. The gold smuggling theory. Gold is dense. It's also hard to trace if melted down and recast. Clara connected the dots. What if Samuel was smuggling stolen gold inside candles? By mid-1997, there were already rumors about a black market gold laundering ring operating out of New England centered around pawn shops, jewelers, and even crematoriums. But the candle smuggling idea, that was new, and so far purely circumstantial. Then came the warehouse, a small, unmarked storage facility on the edge of New Paltz, registered under the name of a Shell LLC that traced back to an address linked to Samuel's deceased wife. Clara got a warrant. What they found inside the unit was a wall of sealed boxes labeled as wax donations for church retreats. Inside, dozens of thick pillar candles. Clara pried one open herself. Under the soft, vanilla-scented outer layer, embedded in the hardened core, were bricks of gold rough cast and unmarked. Over $2.4 million in smelted gold was recovered from that one unit. The trail back to Neary. Now the stakes were higher. The FBI got involved. Forensics showed that the smelting was done in a makeshift forge, one consistent with what could be hidden in a basement or back room. But to tie the operation to a disappearance to Thomas Neary, the team needed more. Samuel was brought in for questioning. He denied everything. said he bought old scrap gold from customers under the table and melted it down for artistic projects. But Clara wasn't convinced. A breakthrough came when analyzing a wax-stained notebook recovered from the shop. In it were scribbled weights, chemical ratios, and most importantly initials. TN, 28 Oz, appeared 3 separate times. It was enough to suggest Neary had contributed, perhaps unwillingly, to the operation. A quiet town, a loud secret. New Paltz isn't the kind of place where secrets last. As the investigation became public, whispers turned into rumors. Some claimed Samuel had been laundering gold for decades. Others believed the Neary connection was personal. Perhaps Neary had discovered the operation and threatened to go to authorities. A few wondered if more people were involved. Maybe the sons of Hirsch and Sons weren't fictional after all. But the biggest mystery remained. Where was Thomas Neary? There was no body, no blood, no trace of a struggle, just a name in a candle maker's ledger and a missing persons file that had grown cold. When we last left off, the candle shop in New Paltz had turned from a quaint local curiosity into a crime scene. A simple craftsman, or so it seemed, had been linked to over $2.4 million in smuggled gold, hidden inside handmade pillar candles. And perhaps more disturbingly, to the disappearance of a man named Thomas Neary, a modest, meticulous gold broker who'd vanished without a trace. But the question remained, where was Neary? And how did a quiet candle maker come to possess bricks of unmarked gold that could be traced, albeit loosely, back to a missing man? Digging deeper into Samuel Hirsch. Samuel Hirsch had always been known for his routines. He arrived at the shop every morning at 7:00 a.m. sharp. Lunch at 12:15, closed at 5:00 p.m. He rarely left town, save for the occasional trade show or artisan market. But Clara Voss, the retired NYPD officer turned private investigator, knew that even the most disciplined routines had blind spots. Using surveillance from local cameras and old toll booth data from the Mid-Hudson Bridge, she tracked an unusual pattern of activity. Between September 1996 and March 1997, just months before Neary's disappearance, Hirsch had made 13 trips across state lines into Massachusetts, most of them in the early hours of the morning. Always driving a different rented vehicle, always alone. It wasn't until Clara subpoenaed car rental records and credit card statements that she found the link. One of the trips coincided with a fire at a jewelry smelting facility in Pittsfield, a fire that had originally been blamed on a faulty furnace. It wasn't declared arson, but investigators had always been suspicious. The owner had reported several pounds of gold missing before the fire started. Samuel, it turned out, had rented a Ford Econoline van the day before the fire. The same van was seen in grainy surveillance footage across the street from the facility, parked for several hours. The footage was old, blurry, and lacked clarity, but it put him in proximity to 2 separate gold-related incidents in 2 different states. What had started as a bizarre local smuggling case now looked like a regional operation. The basement Ford. A second warrant was obtained for Hirsch's home, a modest 2-bedroom colonial just outside New Paltz, nestled behind a row of overgrown lilacs. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. In the basement was a makeshift foundry complete with crucibles, brick-lined smelting pits, and high-temperature kilns capable of melting gold. Along the walls were mold sets that matched the dimensions of the bricks found inside the candles. But more chilling was a rusted-down steel drum, partially buried behind insulation sheets. Inside were fragments of what the forensic team identified as dental bridgework, possibly gold. The team's working theory: Samuel had melted down not just stolen gold, but remains. They couldn't confirm the dental pieces belonged to Neary, as the man had no known dental records. But the proximity, the timing, and the burned facility all pointed to one terrifying possibility. Neary had discovered the smuggling ring, confronted Hirsch, and had been silenced, not buried, not hidden, but melted away. The sons of Hirsch and Sons. Still, the question persisted. Could Samuel have done all of this alone? The moniker Hirsch and Sons had always raised eyebrows. No one in town had ever met a wife, a son, or even a visiting relative. Clara discovered through death records that Hirsch's wife, Judith, had passed away in 1989 under complications from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. At the time, she had been living separately in Massachusetts. Curiously, the house she died in had also suffered a fire. No charges were filed. Digging further, Clara found that Hirsch had two nephews, both of whom had criminal records, one for metal theft, the other for falsifying financial documents. Both had lived near the Pittsfield smelting facility at different times over the past decade. One of the nephews, Aaron Hirsch, had worked for a short period as a night security guard at that very same facility that caught fire in '97. Now the theory widened. Could this have been a family ring? Was Samuel the face, the artisan with the pleasant storefront, while the nephews managed procurement, transportation, and laundering? The FBI started treating the case as a multi-state conspiracy, with the working title Operation Molten Trail. But with no direct physical evidence linking the nephews to the candle shop, the investigation began to slow. The smuggled candles route. Where were the gold-laden candles going? That question led to one of the more surprising discoveries in the case. Samuel had contracts with 3 monasteries in the Northeast, all of whom regularly ordered large shipments of his premium ceremonial wax pillars. The monasteries were unaware, but it was a near-perfect cover. Religious institutions weren't likely to question excess weight or irregular delivery methods. From the warehouse, these candles were loaded onto third-party delivery trucks and sent to different religious organizations, all under the guise of donation. Once delivered, someone would intercept them, melt them down, and recover the gold. One such monastery in Vermont reported having received a set of candles that were unusually heavy and had quietly resold them to a local artisan group for reuse. Clara traced that group to a small arts commune, where she found a sculpture embedded with traces of unrefined gold, still encased in wax. The operation was larger than anyone expected. At least $5 million in unaccounted-for gold could now be traced across 3 states. And while most of the melted gold was long gone, the pipeline from theft to concealment to redistribution had been exposed. Samuel's trial. In April 1998, Samuel was arrested on charges of conspiracy, tax fraud, illegal possession of unregistered bullion, and suspected involvement in a missing persons case. But without a body, prosecutors could not charge him with Neary's murder. During the trial, Samuel maintained his innocence, claiming that the gold was inherited and he had simply avoided taxes. He refused to name suppliers or buyers. His defense leaned on his age, his lack of prior criminal record, and the absence of a body. Still, the financial evidence, smelting equipment, and candle concealment operation were enough to convict him. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 12. Both nephews disappeared from public records shortly after the trial. One reportedly moved to Canada. The other was later implicated in a series of European metal fraud cases, but nothing stuck. An unburned candle. In a final twist, while preparing the candle shop for liquidation, the FBI discovered a candle that had gone unnoticed stored in the rafters above the workroom. It was unmarked, heavier than most, and wrapped in old linen cloth. Inside was a single gold tooth embedded in wax. They never determined whether it belonged to Neary, but it made for a haunting visual, a single, perfectly formed pillar candle, hiding the last known trace of a missing man. But even now, years later, one question remains. If Samuel really did melt Neary away, where are the rest of his remains? Were they burned, dumped, or turned into something else entirely. By the time Samuel Hirsch was sentenced in 1998, the quiet town of New Paltz had already begun to forget. The shop shutters remained closed. The Hirsch and Sons signage slowly faded from weather exposure, and the story so strange, so quiet drifted from headlines into bedtime rumors. But the candle maker's legacy wasn't so easily extinguished. Though he had been convicted of financial crimes, conspiracy, and illegal smelting, he was never convicted of murder. And Thomas Neary's name was never struck from the missing persons list. Without a body, without a confession, and without any witnesses, Neary simply disappeared, leaving only melted clues and a deeply unsettling trail. But the investigation didn't end with the trial. In fact, some of the most important developments came in the years after Samuel's conviction. The warehouse revisited. 3 years into Samuel's sentence, the FBI reopened the warehouse case when a new unit adjacent to the original storage space was auctioned off due to unpaid fees. Inside, the new owner found metalworking tools and a set of ceramic molds nearly identical to those used in Samuel's candle operation but larger. These molds were designed not for candle pillars, but for statues. Experts speculated they could have been used to encase larger smelting jobs, possibly even organic material. Human-sized wax castings, perhaps. Though no DNA evidence was recovered from the molds, the theory grew that Samuel had used his candle expertise for more than gold laundering, that perhaps bodies or body parts were encased, destroyed, or altered using the same meticulous process. The scope of what he had built was more sophisticated than originally believed. His system didn't just hide gold, it may have erased people. New eyewitnesses, old lies. In 2004, Clara Voss, who had stayed loosely attached to the case, received an anonymous letter postmarked from Buffalo. The handwriting was shaky and the message cryptic. He said, "The wax keeps everything still. The first one talked too much, the next ones didn't." There was no return address, but the stamp had fingerprints partial and degraded. When run through the system, they came back as a low-probability match to Aaron Hirsch, Samuel's nephew. Investigators believed he had fled to Canada or upstate New York years earlier. This was the first direct link, placing Aaron at the scene and suggesting there may have been more victims. The FBI reclassified parts of the case under a broader task force, examining missing itinerant individuals in New York and Massachusetts between 1995 and 1998. 3 names stood out. Raymond Lee, a small-time metals dealer from Springfield. M.A. vanished in late 1996. Lucinda Mao, an estate executor and gold appraiser, last seen in Albany in early 1997. Luther Pankey, an ex-convict and suspected smuggling informant, reported missing from Poughkeepsie in 1998. Each had one connection in common. They handled gold privately and informally, often without oversight or full documentation. Each had also, at some point, been seen at regional artisan fairs or trade shows where Samuel had set up a booth. Had the candle maker used his public-facing charm to draw in the unwary? If so, was he acting alone? The confession that never came. Samuel Hirsch remained incarcerated at Allenwood Low Security Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania. He became known for his quiet demeanor, often volunteering in the prison workshop and predictably teaching candle-making classes to other inmates. Over the years, multiple journalists and criminal psychologists attempted interviews. All were denied. In 2012, Samuel was granted a recorded deposition in connection to a civil case brought by the family of Thomas Neary. The deposition, which lasted nearly 4 hours, included several moments of eerie reflection. Attorney: Mr. Hirsch, did you ever come into contact with Thomas Neary in any professional or personal setting? Samuel: there are names we remember and names we never hear. I'm not sure which his was. Attorney: Can you explain what you meant when you wrote TN 28 Oz in your workshop ledger? Samuel, sometimes wax needs a center, something to hold it down. Maybe that was it. Attorney, was that center made of Thomas Neary? Samuel, long pause. Some centers never melt, even if you try. He never admitted to murder, but his answers haunted investigators and legal teams for years afterward. They were vague, poetic, and strangely self-satisfied, as if he took pride in what he built, without ever needing to defend it. A final flame. Samuel Hirsch died in prison in 2017 at the age of 79. The cause of death was listed as complications from a stroke. Among his possessions were a pair of worn, wax-stained gloves, a collection of hand-carved wick holders, and a small notebook filled with sketches. One of those sketches, later shared by a prison orderly, showed a pillar candle, but instead of a wick, there was a human tooth at the center, surrounded by flames. The FBI quietly closed the active case file in 2018, reclassifying it as closed with unresolved homicide suspicions. To this day, Thomas Neary's body has never been found. And though the smuggling network has long been dismantled, the question remains whether other artisans, copycats, or co-conspirators took up the mantle, hiding gold, secrets, or worse, inside works of wax and flame. Legacy, crime in quiet corners. The case of the candle maker who hid gold in wax changed the way investigators approached small-scale smuggling operations. It led to new forensic procedures for analyzing artisan materials, including candles, soaps, and ceramics. A reevaluation of artisanal cover industries used by criminal networks, especially in tax evasion and laundering. Better cross-agency coordination between local police, federal tax auditors, and FBI task forces. But more than anything, it reminded the public of an uncomfortable truth. That crime doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it flickers quietly in the background behind the scent of vanilla, the soft glow of candlelight, and the steady hand of someone who seems ordinary. So the next time you pick up a handcrafted candle in a quiet shop, you might wonder, what could be hidden in the wax? You probably wouldn't remember her face, and that was by design. In the heart of Norfolk County, Massachusetts, nestled between quiet suburban cul-de-sacs and long-forgotten industrial parks, was a small accounting office that serviced landscapers, plumbers, and small family-run shops. It was as unremarkable as any beige office building you pass on your commute and never think about again. But for over a decade, Cynthia Vale, the woman who ran it, was laundering hundreds of thousands of dollars slowly, silently, and legally until one day she disappeared. This wasn't organized crime in the way Hollywood likes to dress it. There were no shootouts, no drug dens, no smuggling tunnels. This was crime in its most mundane and unsettling form, the slow corrosion of trust through clean spreadsheets, tidy invoices, and numbers that no one double-checked. Cynthia Vale, the woman with no ripples. Cynthia moved like someone trying not to be noticed. She was plain, polite, and punctual. Former clients described her as helpful and invisible in the best way. She wore the same tan windbreaker every season, drove a 1996 Honda Civic with low mileage, and answered emails like clockwork. Her business, Vale Accounting Solutions, had no website, no social media, and no receptionist. Just Cynthia. Her clients were mostly local tradesmen who didn't want the hassle of QuickBooks or TurboTax. She did everything on paper, old-fashioned ledgers, handwritten notes, and receipts stored in meticulously labeled envelopes. She was cheap, reliable, and discreet, and she was funneling money for at least 5 different businesses, including, authorities would later allege, a suburban fencing operation that specialized in stolen catalytic converters and counterfeit industrial tools. But no one knew, not for years. The discovery was an accident. It began in early 2014 with a routine property audit. A local plumbing company, Hayes Mechanical, was attempting to refinance their commercial property when their bank flagged irregularities in their quarterly profit statements. Their taxes, prepared by Cynthia, had been neatly filed but didn't match internal estimates or supplier invoices. At first, everyone assumed it was a mistake. The company had grown fast, added staff, moved inventory. A miscalculation wasn't unusual. But when a junior accountant from the bank attempted to contact Cynthia, she didn't respond. In fact, she hadn't responded to any emails or calls for nearly 2 weeks. One of the Hayes partners decided to drive to her office. The blinds were drawn. The mailbox was stuffed. Her Civic was gone. When police were called in for a wellness check, they found the front door locked, the lights off, and a handwritten note taped to the inside glass. Closed due to medical leave. Will resume service shortly. It was dated 2 weeks earlier, the same day Hayes Mechanical sent over the documents for review. Cynthia was officially declared missing 5 days later. What they found inside the office. A second warrant revealed a space so pristine it looked staged. There were no personal belongings in the office, no family photos, no coffee mugs, no paper trail, literally. All filing cabinets had been emptied. Shred bins were missing. The only items left behind were 3 large ledger books carefully stacked on the desk. Each book was identical in format, a grid of client names, services rendered, and totals owed. But as investigators dug deeper, they noticed something unusual. Every 10th page had a faint smudge and oil stain in the top right corner. The numbers on those pages, when traced across clients, reflected perfectly rounded amounts: $1,000, $2,500, $10,000 across unrelated businesses. None of them had corresponding receipts. None were listed in client records. These were Cynthia's shadow entries, her personal bank. The trail of missing money. Within weeks, a pattern emerged. 17 businesses in Norfolk County had received falsified tax returns, all prepared by Cynthia. At least $480,000 in funds had been rerouted to offshore accounts, primarily in the Cayman Islands and Panama. Cynthia had used shell companies under obscure trade names like Urban Spool, East Oak Assets, and RD Supplies Limited. Most of the businesses had no idea. Some didn't even understand the scheme until IRS agents knocked on their doors. And this is what made the case so fascinating. Cynthia never stole money from the businesses directly. Instead, she inflated deductions, fabricated expenses, and quietly rerouted refund amounts through a spiderweb of deposit accounts, often leaving the client with a tax return slightly smaller than expected, but not enough to raise suspicion. She was skimming the federal government, not her clients, and she did it for 12 years. Was she alone? The deeper the IRS and FBI looked, the stranger it became. Cynthia's personal records were nearly non-existent. No mortgage or rental records. No family members listed on tax returns. No driver's license renewals in the last 5 years. No medical records or recent prescriptions. No digital presence, not even a library card. She had existed, but barely. Then came a break. A former client, Victor Gutierrez, a retired roofer, came forward claiming Cynthia had offered him an unusual service years earlier, a way to protect cash assets from divorce court. She had drawn up legal-looking documents, created a fake consulting contract, and offered to route money through an asset conversion trust. He never took the deal, but the wording stuck with him. Investigators realized Cynthia had been offering quiet laundering for more than just tax clients. She had helped people disappear money and possibly helped herself disappear in the process. The final withdrawal. Using subpoenaed banking records, agents discovered Cynthia had made a single withdrawal from a Massachusetts credit union, $8,200 in cash on the day before she vanished. That amount stayed below federal reporting limits and didn't raise alarms at the time. More importantly, surveillance footage showed her wearing a dark red coat, not her usual tan windbreaker. Her hair was dyed darker, and she was wearing glasses she hadn't worn before. A small detail but significant. Cynthia had begun changing her appearance. A bus ticket purchased under the name Lucinda Vell was also flagged a one-way ticket to Bangor, Maine, bought 2 hours after the withdrawal. The name was a nearly perfect anagram of her real one. But after Bangor, there was nothing. Questions that remain. If Cynthia was operating alone, how did she manage offshore accounts and shell companies with such precision? If she had partners, why haven't any come forward or been caught? Why leave behind the ledgers at all? Was it a warning, a message, a misstep? To this day, Cynthia Vale remains on the FBI's financial crimes most wanted list. No credible sightings have been confirmed. She would be in her early 60s today. Some believe she's living in South America under a new identity. Others say she never left New England at all, that she disappeared into the same quiet void she once operated from. Just another face in a crowd, keeping books for someone else under a different name. And some believe she's dead, the victim of someone she helped, who decided silence was safer than gratitude. But here's what you're left wondering as you lay in bed tonight. How many quiet crimes are hidden in plain sight behind a friendly smile, a manila envelope, and the phrase, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it"? When Cynthia Vale vanished from her small Massachusetts office in 2014, she didn't just leave behind unanswered emails and unpaid invoices. She left behind an entire financial underworld, woven seamlessly into middle-class business records, tax forms, and handwritten ledgers that had fooled the IRS for over a decade. In the months that followed her disappearance, investigators worked through layers of legal fog. What began as a simple case of tax fraud ballooned into a slow, haunting dissection of the invisible threads that connect financial deception, identity manipulation, and something even darker: the possibility that Cynthia Vale wasn't just a bookkeeper, but a black market financial architect. The other identities. A forensic accountant named Mara Dinsmore, brought in to assist the FBI's Boston field office, was the first to notice an odd pattern in Cynthia's financial shell companies. Each company was registered in a different state. Each had a mailing address, sometimes a UPS drop box, sometimes a long-abandoned storefront, and each was tied to a different version of Cynthia's name. Lucinda Vell, Maine. Cynthia Valen, Pennsylvania. CV Ledger, Vermont. Thea Vales, Delaware. Every name was just different enough to avoid immediate detection. But more striking was the paperwork. All of these identities had social security numbers, matching real individuals who had died within the last 15 years. This technique, known in fraud circles as ghosting, is typically used by identity thieves. But Cynthia's version was cleaner, more methodical. She didn't apply for credit. She didn't open utilities. She used the stolen identities to open business checking accounts, submit tax filings, and collect returns from clients who never knew their money had been rerouted. All of this allowed her to operate in plain sight, hiding behind a firewall of polite service and bland professionalism. The ledger with a name. But there was one name that stood out in the handwritten ledgers found in her office. Northgate Real Holdings Consult at 42.6K. The company didn't exist in any business registry, no website, no local property taxes, but the word consult implied a service rendered, and the number 42,600 was too large for one of Cynthia's usual refund schemes. It was labeled in a different pen, and curiously with a tiny mark next to it. The FBI traced the phrase through various banking transactions and found that $42,600 had been deposited into an account in Aruba under the shell company Northgate RH Limited. The account holder, one of Cynthia's ghost identities, Thea Vales. But here where it gets darker, the origin of the funds. The money was initially deposited by a small funeral home in Worcester County. The funeral home connection. The funeral home, Pine Bluff Memorial Services, had recently undergone scrutiny after a whistleblower came forward alleging overcharging and billing manipulation. The owner, an aging mortician named Robert Manser, had hired Cynthia in 2011 to help organize the business's books after years of poor management. When questioned, Manser admitted that Cynthia had created a cleaning system for his finances. He described her service as creative tax solutions. She provided him with envelope-based instructions, a system she referred to simply as the ladder. Each envelope was labeled. Rung 1, payroll buffer. Rung 2, expense expansion. Rung 3, depreciation cycling. Rung 4, donation veil. It was jargon-laden, but what it amounted to was a structured way to hide revenue and recirculate it under charitable deductions, depreciated equipment, and cash bonuses, all unreported. According to Manser, Cynthia came to the funeral home twice a month, usually in the evenings. She never stayed more than 90 minutes, always alone, always in gloves. When he asked about the business name on his deductions, Northgate Real Holdings, she told him it was an aggregate shell structure used for asset flow tracking. He never questioned it again. Manser's final payment to Cynthia, $42,600, issued as a consultant fee 1 week before she vanished. The house with no deed. Investigators followed the trail to a rural address in Newry, Maine, connected to one of the ghost identities. It was a small, gray clapboard house at the edge of a defunct ski town. The property was bought in cash in 2012. There was no mortgage, no deed registration under Cynthia's legal name. Neighbors said the woman who lived there used the name Lucinda, kept to herself, and left abruptly one night in 2014, just before the snow fell heavy. Inside, the FBI found a burned barrel in the backyard with ash residue confirmed to contain fragments of ledger paper. A duffel bag buried beneath a loose floorboard, containing $6,000 in small bills, several IDs, and an unopened burner phone. A handwritten list with 4 names, 3 of which matched her former clients. The 4th, Mara Dinsmore, the forensic accountant now working the case. That discovery put Mara under temporary protective custody, and the case was reclassified with elevated internal scrutiny. Had Cynthia planned to leverage or blackmail those on the list, or had she intended to eliminate them? Theory: was it really disappearance or reinvention? One growing theory within the task force was that Cynthia's disappearance wasn't about escape. It was a reboot. Using client funds, stolen identities, and layered shell companies, she may have built a mechanism not only for laundering money but laundering herself. This would require a new identity with a clean legal background, which she was already adept at creating. A modest financial nest egg of which she may have amassed between $700,000 and $1.1 million, based on incomplete accounting. A destination where no one would question her skills, like remote financial consulting hubs, retirement-heavy regions, or expat enclaves abroad. She had the skills, the patience, and the anonymity to vanish. And the silence she left behind, that may have been her masterpiece. Unanswered questions and unresolved leads. Why was Mara Dinsmore's name on the hidden list in Newry? Were the ghost identities used for anything other than laundering? Could they still be active? Did Cynthia act alone, or was she part of a larger network of underground financial fixers? There was no sign of violence, no trace of overt criminal activity like extortion or coercion. Just clean numbers and a woman who built a house of cards, one receipt at a time, then vanished before anyone saw it fall. As you close your eyes tonight, ask yourself, If someone helped hundreds of people hide their money, who might be helping her hide now? When we left off, the woman known as Cynthia Vale had not only vanished without a trace, but possibly reinvented herself entirely, leaving behind a string of financial ghost trails, a list of unsettlingly curated targets, and a blueprint for one of the most quietly complex laundering operations the Northeast had ever seen. But while the headlines died down and the tips slowed to trickle, for those left to pick up the pieces, her clients, her investigators, and the victims of the schemes she enabled, the impact was lasting. Cynthia's name still lingered, whispered not in criminal circles, but among forensic accountants, fraud examiners, and investigative journalists who saw in her a blueprint for financial crimes that don't need to shout to destroy lives. Fallout: the collateral damage of precision crime. In the 2 years following Cynthia's disappearance, 7 small businesses were audited by the IRS due to filings linked to her. Not all were complicit. Most were ordinary people: roofers, mechanics, family-owned HVAC firms who had no idea their deductions were inflated, their returns padded, or that the bookkeeper they trusted was washing their filings through stolen identities and offshore fronts. The audits resulted in over $430,000 in back taxes and penalties across these businesses. 2 of them closed permanently. One owner, Donnie Finch, lost his house after being forced to pay off debt he didn't even know he owed. "I handed her a box of receipts, and she gave me a number," he told the Boston Globe. "That number let me keep my lights on. It never occurred to me to ask if it was too good to be true." For investigators, the tragedy wasn't just in the missing money. It was in the deliberate elegance of the fraud. Cynthia never overreached, never stole more than what could be passed off as clerical error, never triggered a single automatic flag. Until she vanished, no one had a reason to look twice. The cold case heats up briefly. In 2019, a woman matching Cynthia's physical description was spotted at a credit union in Burlington, Vermont, attempting to open a joint account using the name Lee Valent. Security footage showed a woman in her 60s, wearing a wool coat and glasses, hair tucked under a knit cap. What stood out wasn't her face, but the way she moved. "She handled paperwork like it was ritual," said the bank manager. "Every form was aligned, every line perfectly filled. It was almost surgical." By the time local authorities were notified, she was gone. Her fingerprints didn't match those in the system, but an ATM receipt found in a trash bin nearby led to a storage unit under the name R. DeSalle, one of the names found in her old ledgers. Inside the unit, a small steel safe, empty but for a burned checkbook, a portable scanner, a stack of blank Form 1099s, a printed map of Montevideo, Uruguay. The FBI began monitoring travel records, but no trace of Cynthia or Lee was ever confirmed again. The list revisited. Let's go back to that list found in the Newry, Maine house. 4 names. 3 were confirmed. Victor Gutierrez, a client who was offered offshore asset services. Robert Manser, funeral home owner who paid her last known fee. Mara Dinsmore, forensic accountant investigating her. But the 4th name, it was just initials, FH. To this day, investigators have not confirmed who that might refer to. Theories abound. A former partner, a family member long thought unrelated, or someone Cynthia feared, perhaps even someone managing her. The initials remain a keyhole in a locked room, another piece that never quite fit. The quiet blueprint. In 2021, a lecture at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, ACFE, featured a session titled "The Veil Method: Accounting Fraud Without a Trace." The lecturer, a former IRS forensic analyst, described Cynthia's technique as a slow-burn funnel scheme, one that relied not on volume, but on longevity, exploiting trust and oversight fatigue in small-town businesses. The most chilling part: What made her dangerous wasn't the complexity of her methods, the speaker said. It was the fact that she knew how little people understood the paperwork they signed. Her system has since been used in academic case studies and FBI financial training modules. The theory of reemergence. Some believe Cynthia may reemerge someday under a new identity, running a similar operation, quiet, invisible, efficient. There are rumors of a financial ghost moving through parts of Portugal, Uruguay, and the southern coast of Chile, offering discreet expatriate tax services through word of mouth only. But nothing confirmed. Just smoke, no fire. And that's how she always operated, without heat. Her impact in reflection. Cynthia Vale didn't steal with a gun. She didn't vanish with diamonds or paintings. She used ink, paper, meth, silence. She destroyed people not with violence, but with errors they couldn't see. And when she vanished, she left behind not just clients in financial ruin, but an entire field of investigators reconsidering what a white-collar criminal really looks like. Not flashy, not reckless, not greedy, just patient, invisible, and gone. And so you're left wondering, if a woman with no social media, no spouse, and no traceable signature can build a labyrinth of financial shadows, how many others are already out there filing your returns, managing your payroll, balancing your books, and preparing to vanish? It began, as many unsettling crimes do, in a place meant to make people feel better. Nestled inside the tree-lined streets of Rockford, Illinois, just off Main and Mulberry, was a boutique salon called La Vie Belle, the kind of place where generations of women went mothers, daughters, grandmothers for trims, dyes, gossip, and that soft, nostalgic smell of hairspray, rosewater, and cigarette smoke that clung to the air like memory. By the late 1980s, it was a local institution. The staff wore pastel aprons, magazines lay fanned on the tables, and by all accounts, no one ever suspected that multiple clients would walk in for a cut and color and never walk out the same. Some left with mysterious rashes, others with dizziness, confusion, and numbness. One collapsed right there in the chair, blue lips and slurred speech, only to be told at the hospital that it was a possible panic attack. But over the span of nearly 3 years, 5 women died, each within 48 hours of visiting La Vie Belle. No one connected the dots at first, but that would change. And the trail would lead not to a masked killer or a botched product recall, but to a jar of face cream and a stylist with a smile so warm, no one ever looked close enough to notice how cold her hands were. The first clue was in the mirror. The story really starts in March of 1988, when Dorothy Rasmussen, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher, came in for a wash and set. She'd been a customer for years, always had the same stylist, Marla. That day, Dorothy also received a complimentary face massage using a new line of cold cream the salon had just started promoting. Within 24 hours, Dorothy had a seizure. By the second day, she was dead. The cause, acute respiratory arrest. Her family didn't push for an autopsy. She was old, they said. It was her time. But less than 2 months later, a similar incident occurred, this time with Tanya Brooks, 41, who also had her face massaged with the same cream. Her symptoms were similar: muscle weakness, slurred speech, rapid decline. Her death was attributed to cardiac complications. That same month, a third woman, Maureen Alcott, 66, collapsed on her front porch after her salon visit. She survived but never regained full muscle control. Her doctors called it a neurological event with unidentified toxic elements. It took another death and one curious niece to begin pulling on the thread. The niece who paid attention. Carla Alcott, Maureen's niece, worked as a pharmacy technician. When her aunt fell ill, Carla had pressed for more tests. The results were inconclusive, but something about her aunt's rapid decline and the odd, perfumed scent that lingered on her skin made her uncomfortable. When Dot Rasmussen died, Carla dismissed it. But when she learned that Tanya Brooks had the same symptoms, and that both had seen the same stylist at the same salon, she grew suspicious. Carla started asking questions quietly at first. She visited La Vie Belle as a walk-in, requesting a basic facial massage. She paid attention to the cold cream jar unlabeled, kept in the back room with a handwritten note on the lid. Marla only. She took a sample. Later, she had a colleague at the pharmacy run a basic chemical screen. The results weren't official, but they were startling. The cream tested positive for trace amounts of botulinum toxin, the same substance used in minute doses for cosmetic injections, but deadly in its pure form if improperly administered. Carla went to the police, but the authorities hesitated without a body or a direct line to criminal intent. It was a circumstantial claim. A low-grade poison in a beauty product. Mistakes happen. There was no smoking gun. Yet, the woman behind the jar. Marla Devlin was, by all public accounts, the heart of La Vie Belle. She worked there for 14 years, never missed a shift. Clients adored her. She was 48, unmarried, lived with her cat in a modest duplex, and had a reputation for being charmingly meticulous. Always had a fresh pot of coffee on in the back. Always wore gloves during treatments for hygiene, she said. But it was Marla who brought in the new cold cream line. It was Marla who insisted on applying it herself, even refusing to let other stylists use it. She claimed it was her signature service. After Carla's report, the salon underwent an inspection. The cold cream jar was gone. When asked about it, Marla said she'd thrown it out due to spoilage. No record of its brand, purchase, or ingredients existed. It had never been part of the salon's official inventory. And shortly after the inspection, Marla quit, citing emotional distress caused by baseless accusations. That's when investigators got involved in earnest. The case opens for real. In 1989, Rockford PD launched an official inquiry into La Vie Belle and the unexplained medical events tied to the salon. They exhumed two of the deceased clients, Dot Rasmussen and Tanya Brooks, and ran full toxicology panels. Both showed abnormal traces of neurotoxins consistent with type of botulinum exposure, not enough to suggest injection, but enough to imply topical absorption through mucosal membranes, like the nose, mouth, or eyes. Now it was a criminal case, but they still needed to prove intent. They subpoenaed Marla's financials. What they found was unusual spending for someone with her modest salary. In the previous 3 years, she had purchased chemical compounds from European cosmetic suppliers, not authorized for sale in the U.S., ordered syringes, mixing agents, and laboratory tools using alias accounts, made several large cash deposits, just under the $10,000 reporting threshold. When questioned, Marla claimed she had been experimenting with her own anti-aging products and that the ingredients were harmless at those quantities. But investigators found receipts for botulinum culture kits, restricted biohazard materials not sold to civilians. Still, Marla had no criminal record, no known affiliations, and no known motive. There was no direct proof she intended to harm anyone. And then came the tipping point, a handwritten notebook recovered from her home. The notebook, tucked between pages of vintage beauty magazine clippings and formula notes, was a list. R high BP compliant. Tanya B dry skin anxious. Maureen A high cholesterol slow metabolizer. Next to each, a dosage, a date, and a product code. It read like a testing journal. One entry simply said, "Too much, didn't expect throat paralysis, reduced by 1/3 next trial." Now it was no longer a case of accidental contamination or reckless experimentation. It was medical-grade human testing, done under the guise of spa treatments with fatal outcomes. But there was still one question Rockford PD couldn't answer. Why? Why would a middle-aged stylist poison her clients not to kill, necessarily, but to experiment? What was she building toward? A product, a patent, a private obsession? What was Marla Devlin really after? After the discovery of Marla Devlin's handwritten notebook, a disturbing blend of beauty notes and dosage calculations, the case against her deepened. The carefully calibrated records revealed intentional testing on unsuspecting clients, using neurotoxins under the guise of facial treatments. But what made the case truly unnerving wasn't just the deaths or the near deaths. It was the fact that none of it seemed personal. There was no revenge, no money trail leading to a secret inheritance, no grudge from the past. It wasn't about power, it was about procedure. A method, a process, a quiet, methodical march toward what? Behind the smile, Marla Devlin's past. Marla's background painted the picture of someone unremarkable on the surface, but disturbingly self-contained. Born in 1940 in Kankakee, Illinois. Raised by a single mother who worked as a seamstress. No siblings, no marriages, no known romantic partners. Trained as a licensed cosmetologist in 1959. Moved to Rockford in 1973 and began work at La Vie Belle in 1974. But when investigators dug deeper into her time before Rockford, they found something odd. In the early 1970s, Marla had briefly worked as an assistant at a dermatological clinic in Evanston, one that had once been cited for unapproved cosmetic enhancement experiments, using animal-tested compounds and non-FDA-approved serums. There were no criminal charges from that clinic, but Marla's employment records ended abruptly. One former colleague, interviewed in 1990, remembered her clearly. She was quiet, watched everything, took notes all the time, not for training, just for herself. She wasn't talkative, but she always had that look, like she already knew what you were going to say. A private laboratory. When authorities searched her home more thoroughly, they found a second space, a locked room in the basement behind a wardrobe. Inside was what could only be described as a makeshift lab. Stainless steel counters, mixing bowls, gloves, and droppers, temperature-controlled mini fridge, vials labeled with codes that matched entries in her notebook. Most alarming was a stack of sealed containers labeled with initials and dates. Chemical analysis confirmed that many contained potent neurotoxin variants, some likely derived from foodborne cultures, others possibly purchased on the black market. And alongside the materials was a small, worn photograph of a woman in her 30s, a younger Marla, standing next to a woman with similar features, possibly her mother. Written on the back in faded ink, "She never aged, neither will I." It was the first and only emotional evidence found in the entire investigation. A theory forms, the eternal youth obsession. Based on the notebooks, the lab, and the progression of her experimental notes, the prosecution began to build a narrative. Marla was obsessed not with fame, fortune, or vengeance, but with revering age itself. She believed in neuromuscular freezing as a method of skin smoothing, a precursor to what would later become mainstream Botox treatments. But in the late 1980s, this was still largely unregulated and experimental, especially outside of controlled environments. She wasn't trying to kill, she was testing how much the body could tolerate, testing how deep paralysis could go without complete collapse, testing on real women in real time, without consent and with fatal consequences. The clients speak. Of the 36 clients who received facial treatments from Marla in the last 18 months before her resignation, 15 showed signs of systemic side effects. Numbness in the jaw, difficulty swallowing, muscle tremors, double vision, and in rare cases, temporary speech paralysis. They had all dismissed it at the time as stress, anxiety, or just getting older. One woman, Patricia Dean, described her episode as what I thought a mini stroke must feel like. I remember Marla just gently saying, "It's probably nerves, hun. You've got a lot going on." She always had that way of making you think it was your fault, not hers. The charges and the defense. By early 1991, Marla Devlin was arrested and charged with 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 3 counts of negligent homicide, 8 counts of aggravated battery, 12 counts of unauthorized medical practice, and multiple violations of federal biohazard material possession laws. In court, her demeanor was unchanged, polite, respectful, softly spoken. Her defense attorney argued she had no intent to kill, that she was a curious mind in an unregulated industry who experimented improperly, not maliciously. But the prosecution countered with the cold, scientific language of her notebooks. Reduced by 1-3 next trial. Patient unaware, smooth effect lasts 12-18 hours. Tighter skin observed after 3rd treatment. Risk worth it. These were not the scribbles of an innocent technician. The verdict. In 1992, Marla was found guilty on all major counts. She was sentenced to 34 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 20. Her reaction, silence. No apology, no statement, no remorse. Epilogue, a mirror never lies. Marla Devlin died in prison in 2010, at the age of 70, from complications related to a stroke. Her personal effects were minimal: a single hairbrush, a mirror, and a small jar of cream seized and tested. It was non-toxic. But the notes in her final prison journal revealed one last disturbing entry. Skin loosens when the spirit resigns. It's not age, it's surrender. If I had one more trial, I would get it right. Impact and legacy. The FDA launched stricter regulations on topical compounds used in salons and spas nationwide. Illinois passed a law requiring certification for any cosmetic handling of bioactive substances. The case became a landmark example of gray zone cosmetic procedures used without informed consent. And among forensic investigators, Marla Devlin is now known as the quiet esthetician, a woman whose pursuit of beauty left a trail of broken lives, paralyzed faces, and cold cream that could kill. But as you lie back in the quiet of your room tonight, ask yourself this: how many hands have touched your face without you really knowing what they were applying? On a foggy Thursday morning in the fall of 2002, the cleaning staff at the town hall of Dunsmore, Pennsylvania arrived just after 6:00 a.m. They unlocked the side entrance like they always did, flipped the breaker switches, and began their routine emptying trash bins, vacuuming offices, wiping down counters. Everything looked normal. No broken windows, no forced locks, no missing equipment. It wasn't until a clerk from the records department opened a filing cabinet in the back corner of room 104 that the quiet alarm began to ring. Not an actual alarm, just a strange absence. An entire drawer was missing. Not empty, missing. The drawer held property tax documents and zoning applications from the previous year. Low priority, nothing sensitive. But then someone noticed another missing drawer, this one from the clerk-treasurer's office, and another from the back storage annex, all removed cleanly. No signs of force, no mess. Over the next 24 hours, it was confirmed that 6 drawers were missing, containing not cash, not equipment, but paperwork. Hundreds of files, all physical, all logged, all accounted for, until now. And no one had seen or heard a thing. A town with nothing worth stealing. Dunsmore was the kind of place you drive through on your way to somewhere else. With a population just under 3,000, Its biggest claims to fame were a retired steel bridge and a 24-hour diner that made a decent cheesesteak. The town hall was modest: 2 floors, 14 staff members, and a security system installed in 1994 that hadn't been upgraded since. There were no surveillance cameras inside the building, just an aging motion detector that beeped softly when someone entered after hours, and according to the overnight logs, no such entry was recorded. There was no sign of entry at all. No fingerprints, no footprints, no tripped sensors, and no physical damage to locks or latches. The building had been locked at 5:03 p.m. Wednesday evening and opened again at 6:02 a.m. Thursday. And in that window, 6 drawers disappeared. The crime became known locally and eventually regionally as the phantom burglary. The contents of the missing drawers. At first, no one understood what had been taken. These weren't cash drawers or vaults. They were paper records, some decades old, some recent. The missing materials included zoning applications from 1998 to 2002, property boundary dispute cases filed by private citizens, a drawer labeled Abandoned Properties Active Watch List, internal memos between the town manager and a private contractor called Holloway Civic Design, a drawer from the Planning Commission containing blueprints and surveyor notes, an archived set of permit appeals related to a failed housing development project. Each drawer on its own wasn't alarming, but together they told a different story: a pattern of conflict over land use, disputed ownership, and public-private contracts that never came to fruition. It began to look less like theft and more like erasure. The Holloway connection. Of all the files missing, the ones that raised the most eyebrows were the internal memos about Holloway Civic Design, a firm that had briefly partnered with Dunsmore in 1999 to plan a small-scale low-income housing initiative on the edge of town. The plan was ambitious for such a small municipality: 36 townhomes, public green space, and a community center. But the deal fell through in 2000, allegedly due to budget constraints and zoning complications. Yet internal emails from the town manager, retrieved from an old hard drive, hinted at something more. We need to keep the Holloway drafts off the public docket. Too much overlap in the parcels, and the legal line between easement and seizure is not one I want to explain again. If we reassign the properties under the abandoned register, there's no need for eminent domain filing. This suggested the town had been reclassifying land to move forward on development without public approval, and the missing files were the only physical proof. The burglary that wasn't a burglary. With no forced entry and no signs of disturbance, authorities began to question whether it had been a burglary at all. Could the files have been removed from inside by a staff member, a former employee, a contractor? Attention turned to Janice Elwood, a retired clerk who had left her position in 2001 after 2 decades of service. She'd been known as the gatekeeper of records. She rarely took vacation, knew every drawer by heart, and had once reprimanded a junior clerk for misfiling a utilities permit by 3 inches. When questioned, Janice was polite but firm. She hadn't been in the building since her retirement, and she had no interest in old paper fights. But in her garage, investigators found a metal key labeled DUNS Hall 2 FB, a key type issued only to records department staff. And among her personal books, a handwritten list of parcel ID numbers, several of which appeared in the zoning dispute records that were missing. A growing conspiracy. Suddenly, the case wasn't about stolen paperwork. It was about who wanted those documents gone and why. A deeper review of town records revealed that 5 of the parcels listed in the missing files had recently been sold to a holding company called North Crown Limited, a firm incorporated in Delaware, with no public profile. Each property had previously been listed as unclaimed, or abandoned in tax records, but had active disputes or appeals on file that had now vanished. It was a land grab, subtle, clean, and executed through paperwork destruction, not overt fraud. And the worst part, there were no backups. Most of the town's records had never been digitized. Once the files were gone, they were gone. The inside job theory. As suspicion turned inward, the town staff were questioned. The deputy clerk, who claimed she was home all night, was later found to have used her building access card 2 days before the burglary to enter after hours to finish a late report. The janitor, a contract worker named Levi Gadsden, had no criminal history but was caught lying about which rooms he'd cleaned. The former mayor's assistant had signed off on the Holloway contracts, but left the job a year before the deal fell through. She, too, had kept a drawer key, never returned. The most compelling lead came from a key duplication log, stored in the basement facility's binder. It showed that a new master key had been issued in 2001, but there was no signature on the requisition form. No cameras, no alarm, no witnesses, just 6 drawers gone, and a town that would never be able to prove what it once knew. So here's the lingering question, more than 2 decades later. Was it a burglary, or was it a cover-up wrapped in routine? And more importantly, if the only record of a crime is a piece of paper, and that paper disappears, did the crime ever exist at all? When we last left the quiet town of Dunsmore, Pennsylvania, 6 drawers of government records had mysteriously disappeared from Town Hall overnight with no signs of forced entry, no alarms triggered, and no surveillance footage to review. The only clue, the specificity of what was taken, property zoning disputes, boundary maps, and abandoned land files. It wasn't just theft, it was surgical erasure. Now, as investigators dug deeper, the picture that emerged wasn't just about missing files, but about how small-town governance can be manipulated, when the only people watching are the ones writing the minutes. And what began as a sleepy mystery in a forgotten borough now looked like a long game, played across decades. The properties that shouldn't have moved. The first major breakthrough came when a newly appointed zoning officer, Ruth Ellison, began reviewing the parcel sales tied to the holding company North Crown Limited, which had quietly acquired 5 properties in the months after the burglary. These weren't just lots of interest, they were the exact properties mentioned in previous disputes and permit appeals. And by all appearances, they had gone from contested to cleared for sale in just a matter of weeks. That wasn't just unusual, it was impossible under standard procedure. Each sale had been approved by the town's Planning and Development Committee using clean files, scrubbed of any references to previous boundary disputes, adjacent public easement rights, utility access conflicts, historic claims or appeals, and most tellingly, pending legal objections. How had those documents vanished? How had no one noticed? The answer, they were never scanned. Dunsmore, like many towns of its size, still relied on paper-only documentation for land use and zoning records. Backups existed only for tax filings and payroll. So when the physical documents disappeared, so did the disputes. And when there are no objections in writing, no official conflict exists legally speaking, the land becomes clean. The Ghost Company. All 5 parcels were sold to North Crown Limited, registered in Delaware, a state known for its corporate anonymity laws. Investigators reached out through legal channels and traced the listed agent to a law firm in Wilmington that handled shell corporations for private clients. The firm declined to identify the client, citing confidentiality. But one of the wire transfers used to fund the purchases came from a bank in Pittsburgh, a small credit union that services municipal employees. One of the accounts used in that transfer had been opened by a retired Dunsmore town attorney, Gail Farron, just 4 months before the burglary. When questioned, Farron claimed she had opened the account on behalf of a family trust, but she refused to provide details. No charges were filed, but now, investigators had a timeline. October 2001, Farron retires unexpectedly, 1 year earlier than planned. January 2002, new account opened in Pittsburgh. July 2002, 5 contested parcels quietly reclassified as unclaimed. August 2002, town records related to those parcels are stolen. November 2002, North Crown acquires the properties in clean title transfers. All of it legal on paper, thanks to the files that no longer existed. The janitor who knew too much. Meanwhile, an overlooked detail emerged from the maintenance logs. Levi Gadsden, the overnight custodian, had cleaned town hall on the night of the disappearance. Originally dismissed as a peripheral witness, Levi became a focal point after inconsistencies in his statement were cross-checked. He claimed to have left the building at 11:00 p.m., but an internal network login from a public terminal showed that someone accessed the floor plan directory at 2:13 a.m. using a maintenance account. Further review showed that a back storage closet, rarely used and located behind the records room, had been unlocked and left ajar the next morning, something Levi failed to report. Under pressure, Levi admitted that he'd been paid $2,000 in cash, left in an envelope in his locker with a typed note. "Don't lock the back records room Wednesday night. Trash run at midnight. You'll be paid." He assumed it was from another employee or someone doing overtime file cleaning. He claimed he never saw anyone and just figured it was above his pay grade. The cash had no fingerprints. The note had no DNA. The envelope was standard issue, the kind used throughout the building. The map that shouldn't exist. A week after this revelation, Ruth Ellison discovered a single, folded map in the back of a locked cabinet scheduled for disposal. It was a topographic overlay showing Dunsmore and the surrounding 5 miles, including the newly acquired parcels. What was unusual? The map was dated 1997, but marked revised 2002. It included utility expansion projections that had never been publicly announced. It bore the watermark of Holloway Civic Design, the firm from the failed housing initiative years earlier. But Holloway had closed its regional office in 2000. No new surveys were approved. No permits were reissued. And yet, someone had drawn updated infrastructure plans, sewer, water, electric, matching the current layout of the parcels acquired by North Crown Limited. Meaning, someone planned the post-burglary development before the burglary ever occurred. The theft wasn't spontaneous. It was the final move in a long-term scheme. Who benefited? With the files gone, the land cleared, and a holding company in possession, only one question remained. Who profited? In 2003, a new company emerged in Dunsmore, Milltown Redevelopment LLC, offering development services for formerly unclaimed or underused parcels in mid-Atlantic regions. The registered agent, Gail Farron's niece, a real estate lawyer from Harrisburg. Milltown Redevelopment soon leased 4 of the 5 parcels from North Crown Limited and received state-backed development grants through the Pennsylvania Rural Growth Fund, a program aimed at revitalizing small towns. Within 2 years, the lots were paved, surveyed, and offered as plots for modular suburban housing. By 2006, all had been sold, and no one ever filed a single objection, because there was nothing left to object to. So now you have a puzzle. No fingerprints, no break-in, no violence, no alarm, just missing files, quiet keys, and a small-town government that now wears a new coat of paint, one built atop paper, that was never supposed to go missing. The redevelopment of the 5 contested properties in Dunsmore, Pennsylvania, brought new homes, new roads, and new families to a town that had seen decades of decline. It also brought silence. By 2006, the investigation into the town hall burglary had officially stalled. There were no suspects facing charges, no stolen documents recovered, and no official declaration of what was lost because you can't prosecute what no longer exists. But for those who remembered the clerks who filed those records, the zoning officers who'd voiced quiet concerns, and the former homeowners whose disputes disappeared with a drawer, the crime never went away. It simply changed clothes and walked right into the heart of the town. The last drawer. In 2007, the 6th and final missing drawer, the one labeled Permit Appeals, 1996-2000, turned up in the most unexpected of places. A man renovating an old farmhouse outside Dunsmore discovered a locked metal filing drawer hidden behind drywall in what had once been a study. The drawer was rusted shut, but local police cracked it open. Inside, 42 permit appeal forms, hand-marked maps, copies of rejection letters, and several signed affidavits from property owners claiming they were never notified of their parcels being placed on the abandoned list. The homeowner had no idea how the drawer got there. The previous owner of the house, Levi Gadsden, the former town hall custodian. Levi was re-interviewed. He denied knowledge, claimed the drawer must have been planted after he moved out. He died in 2010 of natural causes, and with him, possibly, the last eyewitness to whatever had happened inside town hall that night. The drawer's discovery confirmed one thing. There had been an internal effort to bury disputes, and someone close to the building had access and motive. But by that point, statutes of limitations had lapsed, and with no physical evidence tying the drawer to any single individual, no arrests were made. The drawer was archived. The case file was marked closed, no further action. A town reinvented. Today, the 5 redeveloped parcels are part of what is known as the East Holloway Estates, a quiet cul-de-sac of ranch homes with small backyards, chain-link fences, and satellite dishes. Children play in the street. Lawns are mowed. Mail is delivered on time. There are no signs, literal or otherwise, that the land was ever contested, ever claimed, or ever at the center of a municipal mystery. But beneath the foundations of those homes lies the memory of red ink and lost paper, the record of people who once tried to speak, only to have their voices filed away and quietly stolen. Reflection: what's a crime without evidence? The Dunsmore case isn't the story of a clever thief or a criminal mastermind. It's a story about how power can shift through nothing more than administrative will and silence. There was no forced entry, no broken glass, no masked burglar, just keys, forms, and memos rewritten. The lesson wasn't about theft, it was about what can happen when institutions aren't watched, when paper isn't protected, and when justice becomes a matter of what survives in the file cabinet. Legacy and consequences. Pennsylvania quietly introduced legislation in 2009, requiring digital backups for all municipal land records statewide. The FBI opened a short-lived task force on administrative cover-ups in local governance, though few cases reached prosecution. The Dunsmore Town Hall now has a digital filing system, surveillance cameras, and biometric locks upgrades funded by state grants. But it all came after the crime, after the paper was gone, after the land changed hands. Because sometimes, the only thing more powerful than evidence is the lack of it. And so tonight, as your eyes begin to close, consider this. In a world where everything is meant to be written down, what happens when the right drawer is simply missing? Some crimes are explosive, dramatic moments caught on camera, fast-moving, with suspects identified and motives clear. And then there are the crimes that whisper, that unfold over years, that leave no fingerprints, no footprints, just a terrible taste in your mouth. The town of Willows in Connecticut wasn't used to crime. It was the sort of New England place where nothing ever happened and everyone liked it that way. But in early 1994, residents began receiving anonymous letters, typed in all caps, printed on thin cream paper, sealed in envelopes with no return address. Inside, the messages were short, cryptic, aggressive. Some were threatening, others accusatory. And every single one was drenched in vinegar. The first letter. The first known recipient was Eleanor Winslow, 68, who found the envelope tucked between a grocery coupon flyer and her gas bill. It read, "You think no one, KNOWS. But I do. Stop PRTNDING." There was no signature, no date, no explanation. The paper smelled strongly of vinegar enough to burn the eyes. Eleanor threw it away, thinking it was meant for someone else. But 2 weeks later, she got another one. "You stole what? Yours?" "Now no." Still no return address, still soaked in the same pungent liquid. She called the post office, then the local police, but with no physical threat, no crime could be logged. Probably a prank, she was told. That would have been the end of it if she had been the only one. But over the next 5 years, more than 60 residents of Willows would report receiving nearly identical letters, each written in the same format, the same phrasing, and always scented with vinegar. Who was receiving them and why? What made the case uniquely troubling wasn't just the anonymity, it was the patterns. The letters weren't random. Recipients were local business owners, former town council members, 2 retired teachers, a retired police officer, a church secretary, a funeral home director, and curiously, 3 teenage boys. The messages varied, but they all shared a tone of judgment, almost moral condemnation. Phrases like, "You owe for what you did." "He knows, I know, soon you will too." "How long did you think you could hide it?" Most of the letters contained no overt threat, no demand for money, no call to action. Just accusation, just vinegar. The smell wasn't just symbolic. Initially dismissed as a bizarre affectation, the vinegar soaking turned out to be more than aesthetic. Forensic analysts later found the liquid slightly degraded the toner ink, making forensic document recovery harder. It also destroyed latent fingerprints, especially when dried in heat. In essence, the vinegar acted as a low-tech anti-forensic agent. Whoever was sending the letters knew what they were doing and wanted them to linger, not just physically, but emotionally. The acid smell clung to hands, to mail slots, to memory. Law enforcement response or lack thereof. The Willows Police Department, with a force of just 14 officers, didn't know what to make of the situation. Each letter on its own wasn't a crime. There was no direct harassment, no explicit threats. The victims, if you could even call them that, weren't physically harmed. At most, they were disturbed and increasingly paranoid. In 1996, the town finally consulted a behavioral analyst from Hartford, Dr. Norman Reich, who called the case a low-grade psychological terror campaign, not for financial gain or ideology, but for slow, personal revenge. He added ominously, "The sender believes these people deserve punishment, but the punishment isn't violence, it's corrosion, from the inside out." A decade-long pattern emerges. By 2003, nearly a full decade since the first letter, over 200 letters had been reported, with more suspected but never confirmed. Many recipients had thrown them away, afraid or embarrassed to come forward. But one recipient kept every single one. Her name was Susan Greaves, and she was a librarian. Susan began noticing patterns in phrasing, formatting, and spacing. She kept them in folders, cross-indexed by content. Her unofficial records eventually formed the only known archive of the vinegar letters. And in one letter, sent in 1999, she noticed a subtle change. At the very bottom, spaced apart from the rest of the text, was a single line. "I watched from the bleachers." Susan showed the letter to police. They shrugged. But Susan remembered in 1983, her high school baseball team had a game that ended in a major scandal. A student had been injured, and it had quietly resulted in a lawsuit against the school. Names were kept out of the papers, but she remembered the case. One of the boys involved, the one most often blamed, had moved away shortly after. His name was Peter Darren, the man who disappeared and reappeared. Susan searched public records. Peter Darren had been expelled after the incident. His family relocated to Vermont, but decades later, he was listed as owning a property just outside Willows and under a corporate land trust. The house was isolated, a 2-acre lot with a converted garage and a small postbox at the edge of a long gravel road. In 2004, Susan visited the local tax assessor's office. She found building permits filed under the name P. Darren LLC, one of which included a permit for document storage cabinetry. She brought this information to the police. But when they visited the home, Peter was gone. The property had been vacated, the mailbox removed, the garage cleaned out. All that remained was the unmistakable scent of distilled vinegar. So ask yourself tonight, if someone spent 10 years sending anonymous accusations, never revealing their name, never demanding anything, what were they really after? Justice, punishment, or just the satisfaction of being remembered, even by those who never wanted to? When the property tied to Peter Darren was found abandoned, and the lingering vinegar scent was the only remaining trace, Willows and police were forced to confront a haunting possibility. The sender of the vinegar letters had likely been within their community for years, watching, remembering, and reminding others of things they were trying to forget. But what no one yet understood was the depth of the sender's memory, or the chilling reason why the letters started in the first place. Postmarks and the pattern of delivery. Following the trail Susan Greaves had started, investigators went back and reviewed the physical envelopes that had been preserved, about 56 in total. While no fingerprints or DNA were ever recovered, thanks in part to the vinegar, each had a postal mark. The first letters, from 1994-1996, were stamped in Waterbury, roughly 40 miles northeast of Willows. From 1997-2002, they shifted toward Danbury, then Norwalk. The final set, from 2003-2004, were stamped from local Willows and post offices, suggesting the sender had either returned to town or never left at all. Even more revealing, nearly all the letters were mailed on Wednesdays, usually arriving by Friday, and often just before major community events: school board elections, church anniversaries, town council meetings. These weren't angry bursts. They were strategic reminders sent to destabilize, to rekindle shame or fear, and always with enough ambiguity that the recipient could never quite defend themselves without outing their past. Who was Peter Darren really? In 1983, Peter Darren was a 16-year-old sophomore at Willows and High. By all accounts, he was quiet, awkward, and often the subject of ridicule. He worked in the school library and rarely socialized. On May 3rd of that year, a group of seniors, including the star athlete and 2 sons of local officials, allegedly lured Peter into the dugout at the baseball field during lunch. What happened next was never officially confirmed, but hospital records show Peter was treated for a fractured nose, broken rib, and severe bruising. His family filed a complaint with the school, which was quietly settled. No arrests, no expulsions, though Peter did not return to Willows in the following year. No one talked about it. The town moved on. Peter was erased until he started writing back. The letters as confessions or accusations. As analysts reviewed the full set of vinegar letters, they noticed something strange. Several messages referred not just to what recipients had done, but also to what they had failed to stop. You were there, you watched. You didn't say anything, but you saw. He begged, you turned away. This shifted the tone from direct revenge to something more intricate, a campaign of collective guilt. Some letters were sent to people who had nothing to do with the baseball incident, at least, not directly, but many of them had been present. A teacher, a nurse, a guidance counselor, even a student who went on to become the funeral home director, someone Peter may have passed in the hall that week. The vinegar then became symbolic. Vinegar preserves. Vinegar stings. Vinegar leaves a sour taste you can't forget. It was clear now these weren't threats, they were memorials. Sent not to demand justice, but to force acknowledgement. The surveillance map. In 2005, nearly a year after Peter's last known location had been vacated, a hiker in the nearby Redfern Woods found a weatherproof box nailed to the underside of an old ranger's platform. Inside was a spiral-bound notebook, kept dry and preserved in plastic. The pages were filled with maps of willows and hand-drawn, marked with houses, initials, and delivery dates. Next to some homes were symbols. For delivery. Times for return to sender. Omega, next to a handful of addresses meaning still unclear. The notebook also included a crude sketch, a rough charcoal drawing of the willows and high school bleachers, with the phrase, "This is where it ended. This is where it started." The FBI was contacted. They took custody of the book, but no further arrests were made. The notebook was never released publicly, but a leak confirmed that one of the pages included the following list. E. Winslow, T. Murrow Rhett, teacher, D. Stiles, coach, F. Blackwell, mayor's assistant, R. Dean, janitor. These were the same names listed on early letters. The town's uncomfortable reckoning. In 2006, a local journalist, Angela Mears, published an op-ed in the Willows and Gazette titled, "We knew, we ignored, he remembered." It became one of the most read local editorials in the paper's history. In it, she acknowledged that the town's greatest crime wasn't the beating Peter Darren endured, it was the silence that followed. She wrote, "He walked away, we walked away. But he wrote back for 10 years. And for 10 years, we pretended it was just vinegar." Angela's article triggered a wave of self-reported letters, as people who had hidden their own received messages began to step forward. In some cases, the letters had caused divorces, lost jobs, and estranged family relationships. Peter hadn't needed to publish the truth, he had simply implied it. An implication was enough to crack the facade. What happened to Peter Darren? To this day, no one knows for sure. The last confirmed trace was in 2004, when the garage property he occupied was vacated. A neighbor recalled seeing him walking down the road with a duffel bag, but never saw him return. His name has never appeared on another deed, utility account, or license within the U.S. Some believe he changed his identity. Others think he may have taken his own life once his message had been fully sent. But there's no record, no obituary, no grave. And most chillingly, no more letters. So you're left to wonder, as you try to rest tonight, what's worse, a town that was reminded of what it did, or a town that only learned to fear the envelopes and never addressed the truth inside them? At the corner of 6th and Banner in Des Moines, Iowa, sat a small, dusty shop that seemed untouched by time, literally. Thompson's Timepieces was one of those holdover businesses, the kind that smelled of leather, lacquer, and brass polish. Inside, The tick of dozens of antique clocks created a metronomic hum, hypnotic and steady. It was a quiet sanctuary from the chaos of the world. But in 1993, a man named Ernest Thompson, owner and sole operator of the shop, would become the center of a case that involved a botched murder trial, falsified timelines, and the manipulation of time itself one wristwatch at a time. The crime that almost was. The incident that started it all was the April 12, 1993 stabbing of Cassandra Wyatt, a 37-year-old administrative assistant who was found dead in her apartment on the west side of Des Moines. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just a single wound to the chest and a set of bloody fingerprints on a towel in the bathroom. Police arrested her former boyfriend, Milo Jarrett, 3 days later. He had a prior domestic incident on record, a history of jealousy, and most damning, his fingerprints matched those on the towel. But Milo claimed he hadn't seen Cassandra in over a week. He said that on the night of April 12th, he had been at a diner, sitting alone and sulking, from around 9:00 to 10:15 p.m., the time when police estimated Cassandra was killed. No one could confirm his alibi. That should have been the end of it. Except for one detail that nearly went unnoticed: his wristwatch. A watch, a time, and a confession. During processing, Milo's watch, a vintage Hamilton with a cracked leather strap, was inventoried and bagged. Officers noted the time it displayed when collected: 10:47 p.m. They assumed it was accurate. But Milo insisted. "That thing hasn't kept time in years. I only wear it because I like the look." Investigators sent it to a forensic lab, where a technician confirmed that the watch did work, but was off by exactly 47 minutes. It wasn't until a paralegal, reviewing the evidence, noticed something odd. Inside the watch casing was an engraving. Thompson 3/93. A service mark. They traced it to Thompson's timepieces. Meet Ernest Thompson. Ernest was 62 at the time. He'd been a watchmaker since he was 19. Soft-spoken, tidy, and always in a pressed shirt and wool vest. His shop was dimly lit, filled with ticking clocks and drawers full of gears, springs, and dials. He kept a rotary phone on the counter and a cat named Minutes that often slept in the front window. He remembered Milo. "Came in with that Hamilton a few weeks before," he said. "Wanted it cleaned. Didn't ask for it to be fixed, said he liked that it didn't tick. I gave it a polish and put it back together." But forensic records confirmed that the watch was not just clean, it had been reset. The time adjustment couldn't have been accidental. It would have required deliberate disassembly and manual calibration. Someone had set it to be exactly 47 minutes off. The theory of a deliberate watch. At first, prosecutors shrugged. So the watch was off. What did it matter? But the defense now had a new angle. If Milo's watch had been deliberately set to the wrong time, then it could have created a false window, a fabricated alibi based on a mechanical illusion. But here where things twisted. Milo insisted he had no idea the watch worked at all. He believed it was just an accessory, that it hadn't ticked in years. And Ernest, he wasn't so sure either. "I reset watches as a matter of habit," he said. "But that one, I may have done something else. Can't recall. There was a man who came in and asked about Milo's watch just after the repair." That's when the name Alan Cross appeared. A stranger in the shop. Ernest eventually recalled that, in early April, a man had come into the shop asking if a Hamilton 1939 model had been recently serviced. He described the piece, including its cracked strap and scratched case. The man introduced himself as Alan Cross, claiming to be a collector who had once owned the piece and was curious to know who had it now. Ernest, citing discretion, declined to share customer information. But the man didn't leave empty-handed. According to Ernest's recollection, Alan looked over the bench, nodded, and said, Looks like you keep good records. That's good. Time is everything in this world. It wasn't until later that Ernest noticed the work log for Milo's watch had gone missing. Alan Cross was real. No one named Alan Cross was registered with any collector databases. No such person had ever held title on a Hamilton of that model. No local driver's license, no state ID, no traceable signature. And yet, a week after the visit, Ernest received a cash deposit of $500 through a generic money order mailed with no note. Just a slip of paper that said, "Time served, no crime committed." Now the theory flipped. What if Milo hadn't faked the alibi? What if someone else had to protect him or frame him? And as you rest tonight, here's what should unsettle you the most. If someone can change the timeline of a murder with nothing more than a $60 wristwatch, how many other crimes have ticked by unnoticed? When it was first believed that Milo Jarrett had manipulated his own wristwatch to bolster a fabricated alibi, the case seemed straightforward. A domestic dispute turned deadly, a panicked cover-up using the most analog deception imaginable. But with the discovery that the watch had been professionally cleaned and reset, and that a mysterious man named Alan Cross had inquired about it prior to the murder, the case turned strange. Then came the deeper revelation. Milo's alibi might have been real. The witness who couldn't remember. Enter Joanne Halst, a waitress at Dale's Diner, where Milo claimed to have been during the time of Cassandra Wyatt's murder. At the time of the initial investigation, she told police she did not remember seeing Milo that night. But after the news broke about the watch tampering, she came forward again. "I remember now. He had coffee, just coffee, sat in the back booth. He was there when I clocked out 10:15 sharp." Why had she changed her story? Joanne claimed her manager had told her not to get involved when police came asking questions, that it wasn't worth the trouble to tangle with a murder case. She said she only realized the importance of her memory after reading about the watch in the paper. The police confirmed her time card matched the claim. She clocked out at exactly 10:15 p.m., and receipts showed a solo coffee order in the same time window. Suddenly, Milo's alibi had supporting evidence. If he was at the diner at 10:15 and Cassandra died between 9:50 and 10:10, as estimated by the medical examiner, he couldn't have been the killer. But then, why were his fingerprints on the towel? And who was Alan Cross? Ernest's shop and the vanishing logbook. After recalling the visit from Alan, Ernest began combing through his physical ledgers. He found the slot for Milo Jarrett's watch repair. It had clearly been torn out, a clean rip from the stitched binding. Ernest also remembered something else. A paper bag had gone missing from under his counter the day after Alan's visit. It had contained 2 customer items awaiting pickup, including a woman's Seiko watch and a pocket stopwatch. One of those clients, when contacted, said she never received her watch back and had assumed Ernest had retired or closed shop. In short, someone knew how the shop operated, and they'd tampered with multiple entries including Milo's. The theory emerged that the watch had been weaponized, used to build an alibi not for the innocent, but to confuse the guilty. The timeline trap. The Des Moines PD, working with a private investigator hired by Milo's defense attorney, reconstructed a timeline. March 29, 1993, Milo brings the Hamilton to Thompson's timepieces. April 1-2, the watch is serviced, cleaned, and reset. April 3, Alan Cross visits the shop, asks about the watch, and presumably steals the log page. April 4-11, no contact between Milo and Cassandra. April 12, 9:45 p.m., Cassandra is killed. April 12, 10:15 p.m., Milo is seen at Dale's Diner. April 13, watch is seized by police. Time shows 10:47. It now appeared that the entire timeline had been bent not to prove Milo's innocence or guilt, but to distort the clarity of the moment, to muddy it just enough to prevent certainty. The fingerprint puzzle. So how did Milo's fingerprints end up in Cassandra's apartment? New forensic testing revealed something chilling. The fingerprints on the towel had been pressed using oil transfer, not direct contact, meaning someone had lifted Milo's prints from another surface and planted them. This technique, while not common, had been documented before, usually by individuals with forensic training or law enforcement experience. Now there were two possibilities. Someone was framing Milo, using his watch and lifted prints. Or someone was trying to confuse the investigation, just enough to protect another person. The question became, who stood to gain from this? The obsession with time. An unusual clue emerged from Ernest's own history. Years earlier, in 1985, Ernest had hired a part-time assistant, a young man who had been obsessed with antique clocks and forensic science. He worked quietly in the back of the shop, sometimes handling minor repairs. His name, David Cross. Ernest hadn't seen him in years, not since he moved to Chicago. But David had once mentioned a brother named Alan, who was in and out of trouble, always playing detective. A check of DMV records found that David Cross had died in 1989 in a car accident. There was no record of Alan Cross after 1990. So who had shown up at the shop in 1993 using that name? And how did they know exactly which watch had been altered? The confession that came too late. In 1996, 3 years after Cassandra's murder, a man named Travis Lynch, who had worked briefly as a contractor in Cassandra's apartment building, was arrested in a burglary case in Kansas. During questioning, he admitted to entering Cassandra Wyatt's apartment on the night of April 12. He claimed she had owed him money for help moving furniture, and that when she refused to pay, things escalated. His fingerprints matched an unprocessed print found on the inside of the apartment door frame. He also admitted to having found a man's wristwatch in a drawer and leaving it out to muddy things up. Travis was charged with voluntary manslaughter. Milo Jarrett was exonerated, but the damage was done. He had spent 3 years in jail, lost his job, his mental health never recovered, and no one ever found out who tampered with the watch or who impersonated Alan Cross. So tonight, if you look at the face of your wristwatch, ask yourself, is it telling you the time or just the version someone wants you to believe? By the time Milo Jarrett was exonerated in 1996, the case had become less about the murder of Cassandra Wyatt and more about how easily the structure of time could be bent. Not by sophisticated tech, not by hacking security cameras or falsifying digital data, but by the careful reset of an old wristwatch. The mechanical lie that bought a man 3 years of misery and maybe allowed a killer to walk free for a while. The toll on the clockmaker. Ernest Thompson, the humble man behind the counter of Thompson's timepieces, found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't expected. He wasn't accused of wrongdoing, but his name appeared in legal documents. His shop was photographed, his procedures examined. He became an unintentional witness in a narrative about deception, one he never realized he was participating in. By 1998, Ernest had shuttered his store. The sign came down, the windows dusted over. His cat, Minutes, was adopted by a neighbor. He left no forwarding address. A retired mail carrier who lived above the shop claimed Ernest left a bundle of notebooks and clock parts in the back room, tied in a brown butcher's string. He said Ernest didn't want them ending up in the wrong hands. No one knows what happened to the bundle. A stranger reappears. In 2001, a man visited the Iowa State Library, asking for old newspaper archives. He requested clippings from the Wyatt murder trial and from the subsequent Jarrett hearings. A staffer remembered him distinctly because he asked if anyone had published the name of the watch model involved in the case. He signed the research log under the name Alan David. A cross-reference of IDs, security footage, and records turned up nothing. The man had paid in cash, used no library card, and had worn a hat pulled low and gloves. In summer. The clerk remembered one phrase, though. When told she couldn't find one particular article, he said, "That's fine. I always carry a backup in a spare minute." A peculiar phrase, but familiar. It was something Ernest Thompson was known to say when asked how long a repair would take. The deeper pattern. In 2003, a freelance journalist, Marlon Bayer, began digging into similar cases nationwide. He wasn't looking for murders, he was looking for miscalculated timelines. Cases where alibis didn't line up, where the estimated time of death clashed with mechanical timekeeping. He found 6 cases between 1989 and 1997 in which wristwatches or pocket watches were mentioned in testimony, and later determined to have been malfunctioning, reset, or inexplicably off by consistent margins. In 3 of them, watches had small, engraved initials in their inner cases. ADT. AD. Cross 5. The cases spanned Nevada, Ohio, Illinois, and Iowa. The furthest west, a 1994 incident in Utah, involved a suspect whose pocket watch had been off by exactly 1 hour, just enough to create a false daylight savings alibi. The suspect was later exonerated, but the real killer was never found. Each of these timepieces had one thing in common. They had been recently serviced, or so it was claimed by an independent horologist. The last letter. In 2005, a retired public defender named Laura Briggs received an anonymous envelope at her Des Moines residence. Inside was a single sheet of typewritten paper, no return address, no signature, just one paragraph. "You can create a perfect lie if you adjust the gears just enough. A second here, a minute there. Eventually, a man believes he was never where he was, and if no one checks the ticking, they won't know either. I never wanted to change the past, just to prove how easily people forget to verify the present." Attached with a paperclip was a small wristwatch gear mounted to a card. On the back. "Third wheel, always the quiet one." It was postmarked from Peoria, Illinois. No other clues. Unfinished business. Ernest Thompson was never heard from again after 1998. His Social Security number was never flagged for employment, benefits, or taxes. His last known bank account was closed in 1999 with a balance of $4.76. Some believe he simply retired and disappeared, weary of a world that had changed around him. Others believe he may have been a participant in something deeper, maybe even the mechanical hand behind the timeline manipulations. After all, he'd kept records, and someone had stolen them. Was Ernest a pawn, a witness, or the clockmaker at the center of the web? We don't know, and maybe we never will. And so tonight, as you hear the soft tick of a clock nearby or check the time glowing on your wrist, remember, time isn't always as accurate as it seems. Sometimes it's off by a minute, and sometimes it's off by a murderer. At the northern fringe of Maine's coastline, between ragged granite inlets and fog-draped docks, sits a tiny fishing town called Ulysses Bay. Population, 743. In the early morning hours, the salt hangs thick in the air, heavy, ancient, as though the sea itself is trying to preserve the place in brine. And for years it did. Preserve things, that is. Preserve secrets. It began with a set of bones found in 2008 beneath a shuttered salt-packing warehouse, a place the locals had long avoided. But it wouldn't be the bones that frightened them most, it would be the man who once owned the salt. and how no one could agree if he'd ever existed at all. The discovery beneath the warehouse. The Salton and Sons packing house, established in 1937, had been abandoned since the late 80s. In its heyday, it had been the lifeline of Ulysses Bay, churning out barrels of salt-cured herring, cod, and scallops by the ton. But after the fishing decline of the late 20th century, and with federal inspections tightening, the plant was shuttered padlocked and left to rot beside the Atlantic. In June 2008, a pair of amateur photographers exploring urbex sites pried open a side entrance. In the basement, behind a collapsed beam, they found a small concrete-walled room, almost a cell, and inside it, a wooden crate filled with bones. There was no sign of clothing, no personal effects, and most disturbingly, no natural decomposition. Instead, the bones were coated in salt, densely packed, as if preserved. Lab analysis later confirmed the remains had been there for decades, possibly since the 1950s. The salt had leached out all organic matter and arrested decay, creating a natural mummification. And the locals knew immediately this had to be Salt Man's doing. The man with no first name. Among older generations in Ulysses Bay, there were whispers about a figure called only Salt Man. No one agreed on his real name. Some called him Mr. Salton, claiming he ran the factory. Others said that Salton was just a business name and that he had no family, no record, and no official ownership of the property. He was described inconsistently. Tall, thin, wore black rubber aprons. Short man with thick glasses. Spoke with a stutter or maybe an accent. No photos. No tax records. Not a single public document tying anyone by that name to the business. But everyone agreed on one thing. He worked late, alone, and he didn't like people asking questions. Disappearances in the Bay. Between 1948 and 1961, 6 people were reported missing in or near Ulysses Bay. 4 were listed as likely drownings. 1 a drifter left town abruptly. The 6th, Arlene Das, a 21-year-old newlywed, vanished after leaving her job at the cannery. Each case was closed. There was never enough evidence to point to foul play. But residents now began to whisper that the Salt Man's factory had long held more than fish. A former dock worker, Gus Eberly, who was 85 at the time of the 2008 discovery, gave an interview to a local paper. "We all knew something was wrong in there, but salt covers everything. The smell, the stains, the blood even." He claimed that in the 1950s, the plant ran a third shift unofficial, unlisted. He said Salt Man would keep lights on after midnight, even when no boats had come in. And sometimes he claimed you could hear hammering, dragging, the clink of chains, but no engines, no fish. The hidden room. When authorities re-entered the basement chamber, they discovered the room was lined with marine tarps behind the concrete, suggesting it had been constructed within the foundation, not part of the original build. Salt barrels, long decayed, sat along the walls. And in the far corner, a rusted meat hook bolted to the ceiling beam. A forensic anthropologist confirmed the bones had ligature marks on the wrists and upper arms, and 2 of the ribs were broken inward, consistent with blunt force trauma prior to death. The official cause of death was ruled homicide by beating, though the exact manner could not be confirmed. No one ever claimed the remains. DNA databases offered no match. The case was classified as a historical homicide. But the town already knew. Salt Man had killed someone, maybe more. The ledger that shouldn't exist. In 2010, during renovations to a nearby historical society building, a locked cabinet was pried open. Inside, a ledger dated from 1950 to 1959 marked simply Inventory Midnight. It wasn't an official company document. It listed items like 3 casks June 3, 1 crate heavy, July 19. 1 unit ARD. Nothing this month, heavy rain. The initials ARD were flagged by investigators. Could this have been Arlene Das? Other initials matched surnames of the 5 other missing persons. The bottom of each page ended with a signature line. STM. But again, no one with those initials ever worked at Salton & Sons. No records, no relatives, no man. Years of investigation revealed something extraordinary. No employment records for any Salton. No business license under that name prior to 1960. No census data linking anyone with STM to Ulysses Bay. Even photographs from the town's own archives showed a gap. Aerial photos of the docks, wide-angle shots of the cannery, but never a single interior image of the packing house. It was as though Salt Man had not just hidden crimes, but his own existence. And the old-timers. They never referred to him in past tense. They'd just say, "He kept to himself, he don't like visitors." Even now. And as you rest tonight, think about this. If salt can preserve bones for 50 years, what else can it keep hidden, deep under the floorboards of a dying town? After the discovery of the salt-preserved remains and the mysterious midnight ledger, whispers in Ulysses Bay turned into something darker. The town no longer just remembered the Salt Man as a strange recluse. They began to recall moments they had forgotten to fear. Because salt doesn't just preserve bodies. It preserves memories, too buried grain by grain, until someone finally digs them up. The pattern in the barrels. In the months following the discovery, investigators began an audit of the defunct Salton & Sons packing house and its adjacent shipping dock. Although most shipping manifests had long since been destroyed or discarded, the few remaining fragments recovered from a leaky file cabinet in the old Ulysses Bay Harbor office revealed a curious pattern. Every year between 1950 and 1958, there were unscheduled, undocumented shipments recorded as late barrel or night batch. These shipments departed alone, not with regular fish hauls, and always left between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m. Each entry was signed only as STM, the same initials from the ledger. But where did these barrels go? Some were listed as sent to Cold Row Curing Co., a now-defunct salting business in Nova Scotia. Others to private buyers in Massachusetts, Vermont, and coastal New York. All recipients were either no longer alive or denied ever purchasing anything from Ulysses Bay. One such address in Hyannis Port turned out to be a burned-down hunting cabin, condemned since 1975. But a nearby town clerk, when shown the names, paused. "We used to get calls about him," she said. "The man in the raincoat always smelled like the sea." She didn't mean a fisherman. She meant the kind of man who walked in from fog and vanished again, always carrying something, always asking for directions to somewhere that didn't exist. The fog walker. Multiple stories began to surface. Local fishermen, former dockhands, even teenagers sneaking around the cannery, they all described seeing someone near the plant long after it had closed. Descriptions were varied, but one detail was constant. A man in a long, wet black raincoat. In 1992, a pair of teens saw someone standing inside the plant's front lobby, even though the door was chained shut. In 1998, a fisherman moored overnight at the dock claimed someone knocked twice on his hull, then walked off into the fog. In 2004, a visiting journalist said she was followed from the cannery site back to her inn. When she turned around at the top of the hill, she saw no one, but there were wet boot prints behind her. These weren't just ghost stories. They were patterned, repetitive. Someone or something was still walking Ulysses Bay, long after the salt house had been forgotten. The sheriff's file. Retired Sheriff Daniel Crave, who had served Ulysses Bay from 1965 to 1988, finally broke his silence after the bones were found. "I had a file," he said. "I started it in '71. I called it discrepancies." He claimed it was unofficial, kept in his home desk, and documented small but frequent irregularities that never sat right. Night complaints from fishermen of strange cargo, moved between 1 and 3 a.m. Barrels found floating half-sunken, with salt-cured cloth inside. A crate washed up in 1982 that contained rusted hooks, and a single child's shoe so caked in salt it still bore color. Sheriff Crave said the town's Board of Selectmen discouraged him from investigating the cannery, calling it a historical property. After a while, the complaints stopped. People stopped reporting things. Or maybe they just stopped looking. The census that lied. In an effort to track down STM, investigators dove deep into census archives. The 1950 U.S. Census for Ulysses Bay had been digitized only partially, but one thing stood out. On 3 separate census pages, the same handwriting appeared next to empty housing entries. Temporarily unoccupied STM. Transient lodger STM. Declined entry STM. Normally, such annotations are made by census workers, but in this case, no one could identify who STM was. And U.S. Census Bureau records confirmed that no one by those initials was ever registered as an agent in that region. STM, it seemed, had been inserting himself into the town's own documentation, becoming a phantom within the system. One historian described it as administrative haunting. He didn't just hide in shadows. He used paper and ink to become invisible. The Salt Man's signature. The greatest breakthrough came from a forensic linguist who analyzed the midnight ledger, census annotations, and shipping manifests. The signature STM, when magnified, appeared to be not written but stamped. But not with ink. With salt paste. Tiny white crystals embedded in the pressure points. Under infrared imaging, the crystals fluoresced in a pattern consistent with coastal sea salt, not commercial table salt. Some even showed traces of fish oil and brine bacteria unique to the Maine coast. This wasn't just someone hiding in salt. They were writing in it. And tonight, as the fog rolls in and the coastline fades into the dark, consider this. What if someone learned not just how to use salt to preserve flesh, but to preserve anonymity, to cure their very identity in brine? And what if he's still walking, right behind the mist? By 2012, the case of the Salt Man had grown far beyond the discovery of salt-packed bones in a coastal basement. What began as a historical homicide had morphed into a generational mystery, one that seemed less concerned with death and more obsessed with erasure. The man or myth known only by the initials STM had no past, no fingerprints, no photos, and yet he left everywhere and everything smelling faintly of salt. And in the final years of investigation, he took something else. He began to take the town itself. A trail of salt in silence. A researcher with the University of New England's Historical Crimes Initiative, Dr. Nina Martle, published a controversial report in 2013 titled Preservation of Identity, Brining as Disguise. In it, she hypothesized that the use of sea salt in Ulysses Bay wasn't simply for corpse concealment, it was part of a methodology, one that combined salt's natural antimicrobial qualities, the masking of odor, its ability to distort decomposition timelines, and most importantly, its capacity to neutralize trace biological evidence. When bones were discovered under the cannery, they contained no viable DNA. All cells had been destroyed by prolonged exposure to brine. But Dr. Martle took things further. "I believe the Salt Man wasn't merely preserving victims," she wrote. "He was preserving his presence, his signature, creating time capsules of fear and ambiguity, things that would outlive him. She pointed to at least 3 other towns with similar cases. Pinemouth, New Hampshire, 1973, salted remains of a man found in a lobster trap. Chadwick Bay, Nova Scotia, 1966, 3 empty barrels filled with lye and salt. Gannett Shore, Rhode Island, 1959, reports of a man in a raincoat walking the coastline at midnight, whistling a hymn in a language no one recognized. Each case was dismissed. Each town grew quieter. Each, like Ulysses Bay, began to lose people. Not from death, but from leaving without a word. The shrinking map. By 2015, Ulysses Bay's population had dropped to under 400. Entire streets were unoccupied. The cannery district was overrun with dune grass and seagulls. The public library closed. The general store reopened briefly as a bait shop, then shut again. Residents, when asked, had no clear answers. "We just don't get many kids anymore. People move away for work." The fog got thicker, but behind the small talk was an emptiness, a hollow that seemed to press down on the town, like the tide pulling harder than usual, like silence had weight. Some began to believe that Salt Man hadn't just lived in Ulysses Bay. He had made the town in his own image quiet, corroding, impermanent. The final barrel. In 2016, a contractor repairing the Eastern Docks foundation pylons discovered a final, sealed barrel submerged in the bay muck. The lid was corroded, but still intact. Inside, a black rubber raincoat, stiff with age. A pair of thick-lensed glasses cracked. And a small notebook, wrapped in oiled cloth, its pages written entirely in brine paste. The ink was salt, the language was coded. The only legible words on the final page. Time dilutes everything except salt. A town caught in suspension. By 2018, Ulysses Bay was effectively unincorporated. Postal delivery was rerouted. The school shut down permanently. The last church closed its doors and chained the gate. People stopped referring to the Salt Man as legend. Instead, they referred to him as if he had never left. A teenager from a neighboring town, filming a YouTube Haunted Places video, claimed he captured a figure standing on the ruined dock, even though no one else was with him. When zoomed in, the figure's face was blurred entirely, as though the camera couldn't resolve it. Others said they heard him whistle, late at night, not from the sea, but from beneath the ground, where brine still seeped from the old cannery cellar. What remains? The bones found in 2008 remain unidentified. The raincoat, glasses, and notebook are held in storage by the Maine State Cold Case Division. The man known as Salt Man, or STM, remains without legal identity. But the warehouse is still there. You can still walk by it, though most don't. The door remains bolted shut, not with chains or locks, but with a thin crust of white crystals, forming again and again, no matter how often it's scraped clean. Salt, after all, is eternal, and some say so is he.